Hello, everyone. Thank you once again for joining me right here on the Silver Screen Dudes YouTube channel. So, as you may have seen, excuse me, from my instant out of the cinema reaction earlier, um, I've just been to see the Many Saints of Newark, and I thought, let's discuss it. Open the conversation up for the Silver Screen Dudes to air their opinions about this movie. As I said in my instant reaction when I came out of the theater, the thing that people have to bear in mind is that I'm not the biggest Sopranos guy. Now, by that, I certainly don't mean that I don't like the Sopranos. I mean that by circumstance, I've only ever just seen season one of the Sopranos. I know, huge mistake, but it's definitely something that I'd like to get more into. I was watching The Sopranos. Here's a fun story. I was watching The Sopranos when I was filming underwater this is going back about 8-9 years now. We were cruising the Indian Ocean, the team and I, and we had like a 3-day cruise on our boat where we weren't actually filming anything. We were just cruising from one dive spot to another. And on the way, I just binged season one of The Sopranos and absolutely loved it, adored it. I thought James Gandolfini, may he rest in peace, was absolute whirlwind force of nature as Tony Soprano. And I'm sure that's what a lot of you guys think too. So, when this movie promised, so before even getting into that, why did I not carry on watching The Sopranos after season one? The answer is I don't really have a good reason. It is circumstance, not choice. The part of the world I was living in at the time, it was monumentally difficult to get a good internet connection if I wanted to watch it online, and B, find it anywhere on DVD, which is what everyone did back at the time before the streaming services took over. But despite only having seen season one, I was certainly absorbed by the story of Tony Soprano and his family and trying to balance that life of being a mob boss, but also being a good husband and being a good parent to the degree where the man was obviously in therapy. But anything beyond season one, I cannot comment on. I don't even know how Sopranos ends, to be honest. I've stayed spoiler free as best as I could, just in case the one day comes that I do go back and see it. But despite only having seen season one, and despite only having that first season of insight into Tony Soprano's life, what the Many Saints of Newark did, which was promise me what the beginnings of Tony Soprano were, how he became who he was, and more specifically, what influenced him who he was. If I can just bring up the synopsis here, which reads, "Witness the making of Tony Soprano, the story that reveals the humanity behind Tony's struggles and the influence his family, especially his uncle, Dickie Moltisanti, had over him becoming the most iconic mob boss of all time." So, a few things there quickly. Most iconic mob boss of all time, sure, definitely in the discussion, but that different people are going to have different opinions of who the most iconic mob boss of all time is. That's, I guess, something that individuals can run with and air their opinions on. Let's put it over to you guys. Comment down below. Who do you think the most iconic mob boss of all time is? But this is the part I want to touch on here, and this is why I left the movie feeling a bit meh. It's not good, it's not bad, just a bit meh. The story that reveals the humanity behind Tony's struggles and the influence his family had over him, right? So, right off the bat, I want to be promised a family drama, a story of how someone so young could be influenced in a way that results in him becoming the most notorious, most famous mob boss of all time. First of all, I'd like to throw amazing applause in the direction of Michael Gandolfini. Because he does look like his father. Like, he does look like the late, great James Gandolfini if the late, great James Gandolfini was younger. At least that's how I imagine how James Gandolfini would look. So, given how green he is as an actor, I mean, well done him. Now, The producers and the director obviously acknowledged and realized that he was quite green, which is why he's not on screen that much. Which is a weird choice considering that this is meant to be a movie about how he became who he is, right? What I would have been expecting would have been almost something a bit Goodfellas-esque, you know, something. So you see in the Goodfellas, obviously, you see the young Henry Hill, and you see it's very short at the beginning before he becomes full-fledged adult gangster, obviously. But you can definitely see influences that led to Henry Hill becoming who he was. He liked the way the gangsters looked. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be a gangster. He liked the fact that, you know, the gangsters came and looked after him when he was a kid. He liked the fact that the gangsters gave him his first job. He took, you know, he went down for the gangsters from a young age. They brought him in and they gradually ranked him up. You know, there was, although told in a very short, concise way, there was a very clear passage of, okay, here's how a young man has moved into the gang world. Personally, I thought that wasn't the case with the Many Saints of Newark. I didn't get the impression that we had a real, hey, here's how he went from A to B. I never got that impression. Now, don't get me wrong. There are things that happened in his life. I'm going to have to go into minor spoilers here. Well, not minor, major spoilers for the movie if you haven't seen it. But there are certainly things that happened to Tony Antonio, which one could see reasonably damaging him, which one could see definitely hurting him to his core. As the synopsis of the film says, the huge influence on his life is his uncle Dicky Moltisanto. And the movie centers on Dicky, not on Tony. That's something which again surprised me. I didn't have an issue with that because I found Dicky to be a really interesting character, but it's ultimately Dicky's death which you get the feeling that was the gut punch to Tony. There's a series of events that happen, of course, that lead to Tony wanting to connect more with his uncle, and the uncle's at a stage where he's pushed him away. I'll get on to more why the uncle's pushed him away in a moment. And that kind of is at the crux of what bothers me about this movie. So we'll get on to that in a moment. But, I've lost family members. I've had a lot of people around me lose family members. I'm sure you guys have all lost family members. It's one of the painful facts of life. Now, I've gone to some dark places in my past because of losing family members, you know, dark places emotionally, internally. But I've not really resorted to being a gangster, you know? So, although the story of Dickie is interesting, it's very much running parallel to Tony's young upbringing. It's not something which Tony is directly involved in. It's just running parallel to his life. Tony's there, but you know, we're told for most of the movie that Tony wants to be an NFL quarterback. He wants to become a big sporting superstar, despite the fact that his family don't believe in him. There's not really enough I've seen in this movie that makes me think, oh, this is how Tony Soprano became Tony Soprano. It didn't work for me. And yeah, he comes from a very, very troubled family, but I've seen worse in Hollywood. And considering this is meant to be the inception of the great Tony Soprano, I was expecting a family story that would have been one of the worst that I've seen, but it wasn't. Yeah, the mother is really paranoid and, you know, she's got some demons going on up here. The father's really unwarm and unloving, highly racist, highly confrontational, highly aggressive. Although you never see him being overtly aggressive towards Tony. You know, he never actually, you know, physically beats him or does anything like that. He doesn't show him enough love. And then Dickie, who's the only one who Tony listens to, then both physically and emotionally evades him. So these are all tragic things that can happen to a young man. And it's obviously something which is very real. And it's the sort of thing you sadly read about all the time and you hear about all the time. But that doesn't lead to someone becoming a gangster. And it certainly doesn't lead to someone, although I'm sure it can, that and a number of other factors. I'm not saying it's an impossibility. It can. But it's highly unlikely. And for that to then be what creates Tony Soprano, I kind of left the theater going, so I enjoyed it, and the but being, I wasn't convinced that the story that I saw unfold in front of me, which, going back to the synopsis again, bringing it up, the synopsis reading, the story that reveals the humanity behind Tony's struggles and over him becoming the most iconic mob boss of all time. I didn't see that story. What I saw was entertaining, for most part. Although considering the movie's not that long, I think the one thing I could accuse it of is dragging quite a bit. It wasn't the fact it felt slow paced. Now, some mob movies are purposefully slow paced, things like Once Upon a Time in America. But Once Upon a Time in America is so long, it's got an intermission and the time still flies by. But you can tell that it's a purposefully slow burn. This felt slow, and I don't think its intention was to feel slow. So that tells me it had some pacing issues. And again, I can only speak about my own personal experience and what I felt here, of course. But yeah, going back to it. So what happened to Tony, if we're just focusing on Tony's story, wasn't enough for me to buy into this is how he became the scary mob boss that he is. And again, take all this with a pinch of salt, because I know I saw some humanity in Tony Soprano in season 1 of The Sopranos. What happened after that, I don't know. The other thing, and this is kind of what leads to to Dicky Moltisanto distancing himself from Tony. So Dicky Moltisanto's father is played by Ray Liotta. Now, he and Ray Liotta have got a tumultuous relationship, really, really full of conflict. We find out that Ray Liotta used to beat his mum. Mum died. We're not told that it was through beating, but it's kind of insinuated. Ray Liotta's new bride, who's like 40, 50 years younger than him, she's like this Miss Italy superstar. You know, Dickie can hear once Ray Liotta brings her back that he starts to beat her too. And that's what ultimately leads to Dickie killing his father and then burning him in his own warehouse to kind of hide the fact that he killed him, because his father's a made man. His father's a gangster. You don't do that to a made man, of course. Now, here's where the movie made a creative decision. If it works for you, the movie will work. And sadly, it didn't necessarily work for me. What we find out is that Dicky Moltisanto's father, played by Ray Liotta, out of the blue, out of nowhere, has a twin brother. Who knew? And although the movie does explain, hey, this guy is his brother, this guy's the twin brother, and this guy, we haven't seen him until now because XYZ reason, there are reasons given, and they're perfectly valid ones. The reason being that Ray Liotta 1 wanted to keep his family away from Ray Liotta 2, because Ray Liotta 2, who's in prison, killed a made man, essentially. But that's a creative decision which will either sit well with you or it won't. And in my case, it didn't work. And it's this this twin brother who ultimately is what leads to Dickie making the decisions he makes vis-a-vis of Tony. There's quite a good line at the end, which is the brother saying, Dickie, if I may, can I give you some advice about what to get the kid for a Christmas present? Dickie says, sure. And then he turns around and Ray Liotta turns around and says, stay out of his life. Moderately powerful line, especially in context of the movie. And Dicky Moltisanto takes that at full face value. Now, they don't play this part of the movie out long enough. This is where the movie fell short. You only get about 20 minutes of him being estranged, self-inflicted estrangement. So you only get about 20 minutes of him choosing to separate himself from Tony. So you don't get that kind of fall that you were hoping for in Tony. You don't see the full fall from grace and the full pain it causes him, because the movie doesn't give you time to savor it. The movie doesn't give you time to really witness this. What it does give you, though, is just as he's about to, we get to a stage where he's agreed to meet up with Tony, and on his way there, he's meeting with him the following day, but on his way there, he gets shot by, I believe it's his brother. And we'll get to that in a minute, because that was a weird creative choice too. So then, yeah, Dickie's dead after having been estranged from Tony. So again, you can see where Tony's anger and Tony's pain and family and Tony's family pain comes from. But I still maintain, I doubt that it was enough to really push him over the edge. I feel like the story they should have told is everything that happened after the movie wraps, because the movie does just go plock. It just stops out of nowhere, quite abruptly. There's no wind down. There's no cliffhanger. It just stops. I get why they stopped it there, but it's kind of like in Martin Scorsese's The Aviator, where the point where the movie stopped, it was just, for me, just where it started getting really interesting. Like, I wanted to see everything that happened after that in The Aviator. Very much like this. I kind of wanted to see everything that happened to Tony after that, you know, him having to deal with the fallout of his uncle's death, him having to deal with the fallout of not having anyone else who he can turn to, him having to deal with the fallout of being now completely alone and not having anyone he can really trust, not having a family member who he can rely on emotionally and look up to. That would have been the interesting story, but that's not the story we got. What we did get felt like a bit of a mixed bag, and there were so many paralleling stories running through it. Like, there's a story with let me bring up the actor's name because it's going to drive me insane. There was a story with Harold McBayer, who was, so Harold McBayer plays a character. Sorry, Harold McBayer is the character, Harry, as they call him, who at the beginning of the movie, he's kind of Dickie's right-hand man. He's a black guy, and the Italian mob don't really approve of the working relationship that Dickie and Harry have. Gets to a point where Harry leaves Newark, then he comes back later and decides to set up his own gang, and Harry and Dickie collide. Again, this is all a really interesting story, but I go back to the point I was making before. This is a story that's running parallel to Tony. It's not directly affecting Tony in any way. And that's where the problem comes in, because we're being told, I go back to the synopsis yet again, we're being told that this is the story that made Tony Soprano. It's like, but it's kind of not. It's a story of Tony Soprano's uncle, but what's going on in the uncle's life, though interesting, isn't really affecting Tony for most part. There are intermittent scenes where their paths do cross very briefly, but then they go parallel again. And that's where the movie's a letdown, because how, I don't know. I'm by no means a writer. I'm merely giving my opinion, which is just mine. Where they went wrong was not interweaving young Antonio's character into the goings on of his uncle, because it's all about his uncle, which is fine if you're going to show me how his uncle's actions and how the uncle's behavior comes to affect young Tony. But you don't. What you do see is when the uncle dies, you see a resulting Tony in grieving, and then movie cuts. It was the grieving Tony that came after that would have been interesting. Everything that came before that, I say again, wasn't directly related in any way to the makings, machinations, and creation and inception of Tony Soprano, in my humble opinion. But what's going on with the uncle is, as I said, you've got this conflict between him and Harry, which was interesting. The Harry character was actually pretty cool, because they even reference, if you've seen American Gangster, you'll know who this is. They even reference Frank Lucas throughout the movie. You know, Frank Lucas, the great heroin kingpin of Harlem. And you get one scene with Frank Lucas, actually. So it's kind of like, if you know your gangster movies, like, oh, okay, that's pretty cool to have Frank Lucas in here. I like that. That's really cool. You've got this throwaway story with, I was mentioning earlier, the first radiator. So Dickie's dad, he has this relationship with, not Giuseppe, Jessipina Moltisanti. Who was she? Let me find the actress's name. Yeah, it was Jessipina, played by Michela De Rossi. So the beautiful young Miss Italy girl, right? So eventually what's happened is after Dickie's killed his dad, he ends up sleeping with his dad's missus on the side from his wife. And she ends up sleeping with Harry, and then Dickie gets butthurt, so he ends up killing her off. Quite a brutal scene. He drowns her in the ocean after quite a romantic moment, but these are not things that affect Tony. And the movie sells you on the premise of this is how Tony Soprano was made. And it's not. It's really not. So I don't know. I can't really comment on Easter eggs and things like that because again, I'm not well versed enough in The Sopranos. Did it make me want to go back and watch The Sopranos? No, but not because it's bad, just because it wasn't for me really about The Sopranos. There happens to be Antonio Soprano in the movie, and it's not the fact that he wasn't in it much that bothers me. I'd like that to be really clear. It's not because of that bothers me. What bothers me is the fact that the story being told in little to no way influences him. And now I want to go back to one last thing just before we wrap up. So I mentioned the brother, Dickie's brother is the one who kills him. The reason for this is quite weak. You get kind of very mild, and I mean really mild, like blink and you'll miss them, or switch off for a moment and you'll miss them, insinuations that between the two of them, people prefer Dickie to him. But it's not this big brotherly rivalry that they build, you know. It's not what, you know, we're not talking Romulus and Remus here. This is not a deep brotherly rivalry. You can tell one's a bit more accomplished than the other, one's a bit more loved than the other. But the movie doesn't, again, take its time to really even build that brotherly conflict. And then you've got this scene where they're coming out of a funeral, and the brother falls on the stairs because it's raining. Dickie kind of laughs at him, but he also offers him a hand up. It's kind of like if you see someone fall down, it's like your first reaction is, but then, you know, the human in you will be like, oh shit, is this person okay? And that's kind of how that scene played out. If it was outright Dickie laughing down on him and not showing an amount of remorse or care, I'd kind of get it. But nah, it's not. It was just kind of like, oh, you klutz, man. Get up. Come on, let me give you a hand up. And that was all we got. But based on that little slip on the stairway, next thing you know is the brother wants to kill Dickie. It's like, okay. The brother wants to kill Dickie. Cool. And the brother does kill Dickie. Cool. And then the movie ends. Cool. And how's Antonio Soprano been affected? Little to none. I mean, little, his uncle's dead, but not much that it would form the brutal Tony Soprano, that it would create the brutal Tony Soprano. So, and the movie actually, remember I said you've got all these parallel stories running. The Harry story doesn't even really get resolved. Like, it kind of just flutters away into nothing. And they spend so much time, I'd argue, really properly building what the African American population was going through, because this is set during the Vietnam War time. So there's a huge movement, undertone in this movie of Black Power and all that. And that informs a lot of Harry going from being a wingman to being a gangster, essentially. But then the plot kind of fizzles off into nothing. There's a shootout between him and Dickie, but then it just, and we're done with that story. Nothing else to explore there. So you've got kind of a throwaway line with Dickie shagging his dad's ex-lover after he's killed his dad because the dad was beating him up. You've got this, sadly, because it seemed to be a cool story, but you've got this throwaway rivalry between Dickie and Harry, which ultimately leads to nothing. You've got this really unconvincing feud between Dickie and his brother, which leads to the brother killing Dickie. Meanwhile, you've got Antonio Soprano very, very much in the background, not wanting to be a gangster, not wanting to have anything to do with that, just wanting to be a good boy and become an NFL player. That the only insinuation we have that he's a bad man or that he will be a bad man is the scene where they try to hand him a baby and the baby starts crying and one of the elderly in the family says, "Oh, kids, they always know." And he says, "I don't know what it is. You think she thinks she was afraid of me or something?" And it's like, well, sure, because we know who the person you're going to become, but you haven't done anything to like be a force of nature or be scary in this film. So at the end of the day, where does it rank amongst the great gangster films? The short answer is it doesn't. I wouldn't really even begin to know how to score this movie. Does it belong in the pantheon of great gangster films? Absolutely not. Does The Sopranos, just based on the season one that I've seen? Most definitely it does. That's a fantastic story. This is kind of like, okay, I've seen it. I had a fine time, and that's almost a condemnation. It's kind of like one of the worst things you can say about a movie, isn't it? It was fine. It was okay. It was fine. You're never going to motivate someone to go to the cinema on that. It's almost more damning to say the movie's fine than it is bad. You know, when someone's bad and it provokes a guttural emotional response out of someone, people are usually, oh shit, let me go see what's what. Not everyone, but people are like, okay, let me go make my own opinion up about this. James Bond, the recent review I did, being a prime example of that. This is just like, okay, it's there. It's like a throwaway TV episode that you'll forget about in a few days and probably never think about again. Um, it fails in its mission to tell me the story of Antonio Soprano. And what I'd like to do now is I'd like to just do a quick little shameless plug, because this coming Tuesday, we will be counting down the top 10 movies about fictional gangsters. And that's very much because of this movie. You know, it gave me the idea. Okay, we recently did movies about real gangsters. So we had The Craze, we had all sorts in there. That's on the channel right now if you want to go and see it in the top 10 list. This coming Tuesday at 9 p.m. BST, AJ and I will be counting down the top 10 fictional gangsters. This by no means is in the conversation for worst, but it certainly won't be making the top 10. That's it's not even in the discussion. But those are my thoughts on the Many Saints of Newark. There's some good ideas in there, but they don't come to full fruition. The stories that Dickie goes through don't seem to be directly affecting Tony's life enough that I can fully believe that this young man will become Antonio Soprano. Although I do think there's a very beautiful romanticism to casting Michael Gandolfini as his father, playing a younger version of his father. And although he's a very green actor, it worked for me. It was kind of like seeing James Gandolfini come back alive. Sort of. But is it a movie I'd recommend you go and see? I mean, I think if you're diehard Soprano fans, you might catch more Easter eggs than I did. Maybe. If you are a diehard Soprano fan, please do comment down below and let me know if this movie worked for you or not, because I think you'd be a much better gauge of if this movie worked versus if it didn't. But yeah, that's it for me for this episode. Tune in again on Tuesday, where we're going to be counting down the top 10 fictional gangsters. And I will see you guys very soon. Nico Lura right here on the Silver Screen Dudes. Please do like the video, share the video with anyone who you think may be interested. Let me know who your favorite fictional gangsters are. Tune in to join us live on Tuesday, where we'll be counting down the top 10 fictional gangsters, and subscribe to the channel, guys. Turn on that notification bell so you know when I'm going live, and I'll see you all very soon. Thank you so much for joining me as always.